Before he was an imprisoned Dark Lord, before he was a cosmology-breaking god of secrets, and before he brought terror upon your 5e party in Eve of Ruin, Vecna was a little-known anagram that served as nothing more than a backstory for a couple of gruesome artifacts. But neither the page nor the grave could halt the ascension of the most infamous lich in RPG history. It began in 1976 in TSR's first office, a house on William Street in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Listed without ceremony in the pages of Eldritch Wizardry, the third supplement to a new Theater of the Mind role-playing game about exploring dungeons and fighting dragons, were two cursed artifacts. Tucked between such treasures as the Mace of Cuthbert and the Ring of Gax were a withered hand and a preserved eye. They were at first just two of many powerful magic items with interesting traits and drawbacks, the sort of thing a dungeon master might scatter into a treasure hoard to create difficult choices and dramatic consequence. They would enter the D&D lexicon with no significant backstory, no sprawling mythology or lore, other than each once belonged to a long-forgotten lich named Vecna, himself nothing more than an anagram, a sly nod to one of Gary Gygax's favorite novelists, Jack Vance. But that was it. That was Vecna's formal introduction into the world. Brian Bloom, co-author alongside Gary Gygax of the supplement, is widely credited with creating these would-be infamous artifacts. But there was no grand design. There was no accompanying epic adventure. No one sat down and plotted the arc of this new villain. Nobody could have anticipated the trajectory this forgotten undead would follow, certainly not its authors. That this lich would one day menace the multiverse, shatter divine barriers, and achieve a kind of apotheosis that most D&D antagonists never even dream of. And yet, 1/2 century later, that is exactly what happened. Vecna has become something unprecedented in the history of tabletop role-playing. What happened between those start and end points has literally rewritten the cosmology of Dungeons & Dragons, and constitutes one of the most remarkable narrative arcs in RPG storytelling. This is part 2 of the complete Vecna deep dive. With his mortal origins behind us in part 1, which I have linked below, today we chart the Lich God's path of cruelty across histories and lore spanning many worlds and timelines. Of course, no treatise on Vecna would be complete if we failed to uncover not one but 2 legendary betrayals and those infamous artifacts he quite literally left behind. It all culminates in a bonus chapter of obscure lore at the end of this video. And if this part 2 can reach 3,000 likes, I will create a part 3 dedicated entirely to Vecna's most obscure, closely guarded, and canonical secrets. Vecna, the mortal man, is gone, his transformation now complete. But how does a simple name on a page become one of the most significant forces across the multiverse? To find out, we must first look at the shadows cast by his spider throne. We pick up the threads of Vecna's immortality by asking a question that has, by design, no good answer. What do we actually know about Vecna's empire, a sovereign dread that is said to have spanned nearly a millennia? We know so very little, and that is precisely the point. Empires usually get names after they fall. The Romans did not walk around calling themselves the Roman Empire in the same way a student in history class does today. They were simply Rome, and the world was what Rome said it was. Vecna's dominion acquired its title in much the same retrospective way. The Occluded Empire was an unfamiliar term to the people of that era. Still, the word occluded carries much weight and specificity today, so much so that it is perhaps the most accurately named empire in the history of the Greyhawk setting. To occlude is to block, to shut off, to prevent the passage of light. Vecna's empire was built on exactly that principle. His domain of darkness swallowed the ashen wastes and blood-soaked valleys of the Rushmores, choking the lands south of the Velverdiva. This was not a kingdom of boastful proclamations or minted coins with its ruler's face struck upon precious metals. It was a domain of oppression and control that spread through shadow and secret, through cults and hidden agents, through the slow corruption of institutions and individual souls. A cold, suffocating fog of paranoia that turned neighbor against neighbor. The borders of the Occluded Empire expanded wherever Vecna's influence reached, with a methodical brutality that the Greyhawk lore chronicles in broad, grim strokes. And at its core stood a colossal monument to decay called the Rotted Tower. Every seat of power tells you something about its ruler, and in that respect, the Rotted Tower told you quite a lot about Vecna in this early age. A fortress that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual decomposition without ever quite finishing the job, not unlike its undead master. It was a citadel steeped in dark magic and served as the axis around which his empire turned. The conquest of lands, communities, and petty kingdoms that fell under Vecna's shadow faced an opponent who could not be outlasted through attrition or assassinated by conventional means. So, one by one, they each bent, and those that did not bend were broken. The empire that resulted was totalitarian in a fashion that would be remarkable even by the rather competitive standards of dark fantasy despotism. And it is here where the word occluded really earns its keep. Vecna did far more than simply rule his subjects. He oppressed and suppressed them in a proverbial veil of blackness so deep that to write down a single line of unauthorized history was a capital offense, punishable by death. Truth in the Occluded Empire was a commodity controlled and belonging to the Lich King alone. Everyone else received and knew what Vecna decided they should receive and be told, and the gap between what was real and what was permitted to be known became its own form of power. For if you do not know that alternatives exist, you cannot desire them. Think about that for just a moment, because it represents something more sophisticated than the stereotypical garden variety tyranny. Most despots control bodies. They tell you where to go, what to do, how much of your harvest to surrender, how much tax you pay. But the Lich Lord's empire was by any measure a closed system, shut off from the remainder of the world. Mortal generations passed under this shroud. Children were born, grew old, and died without ever knowing a world that was not shaped by Vecna's hand. And yet, within this pitch blackness, certain events stand out with the sharp clarity of a struck match in a lightless room. Fleeth would burn. The conquest of the city of Fleeth stands as one of the more notable episodes in Vecna's imperial career. Fleeth was a city on the Flannis that had the temerity to resist, which Vecna regarded as a personal affront roughly on par with blasphemy. Vecna descended upon it with the wrath of retribution and his mighty undead legions. The siege and conquest that followed would forever curse the ground upon which its walls crumbled. Its precise location and character are described with some variation across the Greyhawk lore, as tends to happen with places that no longer exist, that is, lands that committed the error of defying Vecna's authority. The nature of that defiance shifts depending upon which historical text you consult. Some say the city rebelled openly, others say it refused tribute or harbored enemies of the Lich King, or simply that it failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm in its submission. The cause matters less than the consequence. Vecna annihilated Fleeth completely. This was, of course, the entire point. The destruction of Fleeth was as emblematic a lesson as it was literal. Every empire sustained by fear requires at intervals a refresher course, and the obliteration of a populated city serves that purpose with extreme efficiency. Vecna was making a statement, legible across the full breadth of his dominion. Defiance has a cost, and that cost is everything. As covered in part 1 of this series, according to one version of accepted lore, Fleeth is connected to Vecna's own mortal origins, the city where his mother, Mazel, was cast into flames as a heretic by the pious arrogance of the priests and clerics of Foltus. If these accounts hold truth, then the destruction of Fleeth was personal as well as political. The Lich King returning centuries later to the place that wronged the woman who bore him and reducing it to ruinous silence. While other narratives do exist, framing at least in part a retribution for a mother burned is one of the very few human moments you will find across Vecna's extensive history, and there is a terrible symmetry to be found in a vengeance so patient and so complete that it almost resembles a natural process, like an erosion born of malice or entropy with a grudge. And if you think that's the worst of it, you have yet to learn what he did with the survivors, so few as they were. Because it wasn't the smoldering fires of ruin that would leave the most indelible scars. The psychological horror exhibited in the final act of Fleeth's conquest would mark perhaps the earliest and most visceral hallmark of Vecna's cruelty. A tale so grim that I speculate it is either the origin for Kaz's well-earned title of the Bloody-Handed, or it damn well should be. When the city teetered on the edge of defeat, surviving officials came before Vecna to beg for mercy, offering the entire city and all of her wealth if only the citizens would be spared. Vecna was unmoved, so they offered their own lives in sacrifice. Vecna would select one of their number, a man named Artau, and handed him, along with his entire family, over to Kaz, who spent a full day in the act of slaying each by the slowest and most gruesome methods possible, all while the remaining officials were forced to watch. Vecna's cruelty still unsatisfied, he ordered Kaz to slaughter every soul within the city walls, and then had their heads stacked before those same officials, with those of their own family members placed most prominently at the front. Only then did the Lich King grant his version of callous mercy. Vecna would not only release each of the surviving city officials, but in a twist of cruelty promised his personal protection for the rest of their natural lives. One can only imagine the quality of such an existence. Whether personal or purely strategic or some combination of the two, the burning of Fleeth accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. Resistance, already difficult, became functionally unimaginable. The Occluded Empire settled deeper into its own darkness, a political entity organized around the principle that knowledge is power, and that power belongs to one being alone. What Vecna built during these earliest centuries of his undeath was, in a very real sense, a prototype for his eventual divinity. The portfolio he would later claim as the god of secrets and hidden knowledge, the authority that comes from knowing what others do not, was already being practiced at scale across the sprawl of a mortal empire. Every suppressed truth, every controlled revelation, every carefully maintained gradient of ignorance was a rehearsal for his godhood. He was governing the way a deity governs, from behind a veil, through intermediaries, by the control and manipulation of what is and is not known. The Occluded Empire endured. Season followed season, century followed century. And at the center of it all, tireless and patient, Vecna continued his work, accumulating power, accumulating knowledge, accumulating secrets the way a glacier accumulates mass, slowly, with a weight that would in time reshape the land, the world, and the multiverse. But empires, even occluded ones, carry within them the seeds of their own disruption, a secret, one that Vecna himself had failed to keep, the secret of trust, 2 names, 2 betrayals, each altering the Lich's historical trajectory. There is a tragedy to be discovered in how some of the worst stories begin with someone ordinary going about their business, bothered by nothing more exotic than a pot that needs scrubbing or a floor that won't come clean. Casseri was such a person. Some texts give her name as Cassethri, but the variation hardly matters. What matters are the tragic events she endured. A servant girl on Orth in the world of Greyhawk, she possessed no arcane training and harbored no dark ambitions. She cooked, she cleaned, she made a hard living in the employ of a sorcerer whose name the centuries have erased and who deserves no better. As fate would have it, she would be present as this unknown sorcerer attempted to summon a demonic power from the abyss, and failed to control the tanar'ri horror he had called forth. The fiend was a Balor named Tarnhim. The result of such hubris was a sorcerer that died quickly and a human servant girl that could not escape the violence that followed. The result was an infant Cambion, half human, half demon, born in the borderlands of the Flannes during the early years of Vecna's rise post-lichdom. His name was Acererak, but unlike his human mother, the child bore his fiendish heritage on his body like a brand: crimson skin, horns, all the unmistakable stigmata of demon kind. He was, from his first breath, something that could not be hidden forever. Still, his mother Kasseri managed the impossible for 10 years, a decade of concealment, of drawn curtains, quiet whispers, and careful excuses, raising a child born from violence that embodied the worst of humanity's fears. But 10 years would be the limit. Discovery came, as discovery always does. The locals, exactly the sort of villagers you might expect, reacted with the deliberation of a kicked hornet's nest. They formed a mob. They marched on the home where Kasseri and her demon child slept. They set it ablaze. Kasseri died in the fire. Acererak did not, his demonic bloodline granting him a resistance to flame that his human mother could not share. One does not need to sentimentalize the moment to recognize its weight. Every major decision Acererak would make for the rest of his very long existence can be traced with uncomfortable directness back to this night. Vecna found the boy soon afterwards. His advisors counseled the obvious course: finish what the mob had started. A half-demon child of chaotic lineage could never be trusted. For their advice, Vecna eliminated them. Then he destroyed the mob. Then he took the boy. One should be careful about reading too much charity or warmth in the gesture. Vecna did not rescue Acererak out of the kindness of his heart, an organ he had long ceased to possess in any meaningful way. Vecna sensed something useful in the child, an immense animus already hardening into structure, and a raw potential that he could shape. He claimed the boy as his apprentice, and history lurched forward. Acererak learned fast. His arcane talent was prodigious. He rose through Vecna's ranks to become one of the Whispered One's most trusted generals. Still, Vecna would not be known as the god of hidden knowledge and secrets without good reason. Despite Acererak's loyalty and elevation of status, a rift began to form. There were still many deeper mysteries of necromancy he was eager to learn, but Vecna was resistant to sharing the most forbidden of his knowledge. Those secrets were locked away in the highest reaches of the rotted tower. The manipulation of negative energy, the binding of souls, and most critically, the secret paths toward lichdom, that final escape from the mortality Acererak had learned to regard with such contempt. Acererak's patience eventually gave way to corruption and then treachery. But this first betrayal of Vecna would be nothing like those to follow. It was a quiet plot, conducted in a style that Vecna himself might have admired under different circumstances. The defining moment would come during an early assault as part of the extended siege of Fleeth that we covered last chapter. Vecna had expected a quick victory, as had been the case with every conquest thus far in the spread of his growing empire. However, the clerics of the sun god Foltest surprised Vecna and his undead forces at every turn, unleashing devastating counterattacks that put the Lich King himself in genuine danger. These assaults from the forces of light and order were so perfectly coordinated and precise in their execution, knowing exactly where and when to strike, as to suggest the defenders had been given Vecna's secret playbook of war plans. Because they had, and it was delivered by Acererak. Vecna's Cambion general had secretly engineered the entire crisis, feeding critical intelligence to Fleeth's righteous defenders, a plot designed to push his master to the edge of destruction, but only to the edge. His plans were never to destroy Vecna. In fact, the Lich King's death would have likely foiled Acererak's ultimate goal, to gain Vecna's most prized secrets and necromantic rituals of power and undeath. So in that most critical moment, with Vecna on the brink of defeat and destruction, Acererak would fearlessly arrive to save his mentor. The general swept in with reinforcements, drove back the clerics, and pulled Vecna from the void of nothingness, a void that would never have existed without Acererak's betrayal. The rescue was theatrical, heroic, the stuff of evil legends, and entirely fraudulent. Yet the ploy worked. Vecna, in what must rank among history's most consequential displays of gratitude, rewarded his general with access to those same upper chambers, where his most closely guarded and prized knowledge was kept. This would prove, of course, in retrospect, to be a significant miscalculation. Acererak had just been handed the keys to a vault of secrets he had always intended to rob. For a time afterward, Acererak maintained the deception while systematically copying Vecna's trove of knowledge. The foundational principles of the Whispered One's power offered up to a Cambion mortal whose loyalty had never been anything but strategic. Vecna would discover the truth eventually, he always did, but Acererak possessed what many of Vecna's other victims lacked: foresight. He saw the moment of discovery approaching. And before Vecna's rage could find its target, he was gone. Acererak escaped, which is itself a remarkable achievement. Very few beings crossed Vecna and lived to reflect on the mistake. Acererak vanished south through the Flanez, sinking into the jungles and swamps to construct his own tribute to terror, a subterranean monument to everything Vecna had taught him about cruelty. It would come to be known as the Tomb of Horrors. And he carried with him that trove of stolen secrets, everything he needed to become what he would eventually become. For Acererak, betrayals would become commonplace. The Cambion wizard would, in time, achieve his own ascension into lichdom, by first striking a dark pact with Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, and then betraying his end of that bargain. But that and many other fascinating stories of Acererak, such as his chosen state as a demi-lich, we will cover in a future dedicated deep dive. Nonetheless, Acererak had entered Vecna's grace and service as an orphaned, fiendish child who would have never seen his 11th birthday. He repaid such deliverance with betrayal, and left in the cover of night as something far more dangerous, a remorseless agent of his own ascension, armed with ill-gotten wisdom and unencumbered by loyalty to anyone or anything except his own ambition. While Acererak had vanished into the southern swamps, he left Vecna with a rare gift, the realization that he could be fooled. But questions remained. Would this be a lesson learned as a new lieutenant entered service in the Rotted Tower, one whose loyalty was written in blood rather than ink? If you're enjoying this expedition so far, then maybe consider subscribing, hyping, and liking the video to help us reach that 3,000 like milestone for a dedicated part 3. And I hope you will stick around for the bonus chapter of obscure lore at the end of this video. If Acererak was the apprentice who proved too clever, then Cass was the sword arm who proved too sharp. Cass was mortal once. The lore agrees on at least this much, though the texts often agree on precious little else regarding his early life. Cass came to serve Vecna under much different circumstance than Acererak. Kaz was not a lost orphan, but emerged onto the historical record as a mortal warrior of exceptional skill and ferocity, possessing a tactical brilliance that soon caught the Whispered One's attention. In a court of the undead built upon secrets and newfound paranoia from Acererak's betrayal, loyalty was a rare and most valued commodity, and unlike the treacherous Cambion, the dedication of Kaz to Vecna was from the outset not strategic, but true. For his part, the lore is pretty clear that Kaz served with a genuine devotion of a believer. Perhaps loyalty is too strong a word, perhaps not. Kaz was loyal, but in a way that a wolf is loyal to its pack leader, which is to say, until the moment it isn't. Kaz would rise to serve as Vecna's instrument of force through which the undying king projected his military power across the Occluded Empire. The title bloody-handed, telling you all you need to know about his duties. However, loyalty for a mortal serving an undying kingdom has a short and finite shelf life, and the usefulness of the human cause would be fleeting in contrast to the timescales of a Lich King. In an act that is both challenged with conflict in the lore and far less reward as self-service, Vecna gave Kaz a more permanent promotion, one that can only be found in the curse or blessing of undeath. By turning Kaz into a vampire, Vecna granted him immortality of a sort, the predatory, blood-drinking sort, but even immortality with strings was, to Kaz, a tolerable cost. As mentioned, this account, while most probable, is not without its conflicts, and I will attempt to untangle those later in this deep dive. Regardless, now a brutal vampire enforcer to a Lich King, Kaz would eventually become Vecna's chief lieutenant and right hand, a phrase that would acquire a oh-so-perfect irony that one suspects the multiverse maybe has a sense of dramatic gallows humor after all. Kaz carried out Vecna's edicts with enthusiastic cruelty. He crushed rebellions, silenced dissidents, and maintained through hand-delivered terror the obedience that threat of the Lich King's distant omniscience alone could not guarantee. In due time, Kaz became so valuable to Vecna's plans of conquest that the Lich King would once again reward his chief lieutenant, a gift that would prove to be, again in retrospect, one of the most regrettable decisions Vecna would ever make. He forged for Kaz a blackened blade. To cement his oppressive dominion, Vecna sought to create an extension of his own malevolence, a weapon of absolute ruin that he would bestow upon his chief lieutenant. The forging of the Sword of Kaz was an unholy marriage of metallurgy and necromancy. Of all the artifacts Vecna has created, the Sword of Kaz may be the most revealing. Vecna forged it personally, pouring into the blackened metal a portion of his own essence, sacrificing the souls of conquered kings to give the blade a voice and a fraction of his own knowledge and power. It was, by any reasonable metric, among the most formidable weapons ever created on any world. However, what is often lost in the historical accounts of the blade's forging is the original intent. While we know the sword became sentient, it is important to understand that was never a design goal or expected outcome of its creation. Vecna did imbue the blade with a sliver of his essence, that is absolutely true. However, this enchantment was a symbol of his authority, empowering the blade to craft a weapon of absolute destruction to use against his enemies and a display of his own mastery. But of course, we know now that the blade would find independent thought, a fact Vecna would learn far too late. And like many sentient weapons in the long and cautionary history of such legendary armaments, it had its own ideas about how things ought to be run. The sword whispered to Kaz night and day. After all, this is what sentient weapons do. They suggest, they complain, and apparently they desire. Once an essence of the Lich God, now detached from its tether to the unholy whole of Vecna, the sliver of the Lich's spirit somehow formed its own vast intelligence, and now freed, it whispered its own thoughts, its own hungers, a malevolence that would plant seeds of ambition and greed, watering each quietly and patiently with doubt and resentment. But how do we reconcile this in the lore? The text offers some increasingly significant variations and conflicts as the lore evolves, and I will detail each departure later in this treatise. However, the most common thread offers that perhaps the blade's intelligence emerged simply as an unintended consequence of the dark energies Vecna channeled into its creation, resulting in a parasitic consciousness born from the act of crafting it. The lore often repeats a claim that Vecna, quote, made it too well, or some variant thereof. This suggests that in his arrogance, Vecna imbued too much of his own being into the blade, specifically his malice, ambition, and desire for absolute power and control. Perhaps only an expert in the arcane arts could confirm, but to mundane scholars such as myself, it seems the line between essence, spirit, soul, and consciousness might in fact be razor thin. So a blade, or any tangible object for that matter, imbued with such a powerful fragment of the very thing that gives life, or undeath, might easily develop its own personality and intellect. Whatever the origin, the result was a sentience that wanted nothing more than to destroy Vecna. The sword spoke to Kaz in the private chambers of his mind, and what it said was perfectly calibrated to take hold. It spoke to his pride. He was far greater than he knew, stronger than his station suggested. It spoke to his resentment. Why should one so mighty as Kaz serve another? And it spoke to his ambition, filling the mind of the cruel vampire warrior with visions of greater things, corrupting thoughts that power shared was power wasted, that his master was not as invincible as he seemed. You could supplant him. You could be the ruler, the blade would murmur. You should. You are the hand that wields the power. What is a master without you, the instrument of his power and rule? Kaz resisted the overtures initially, but the seduction was patient and incessant. Kaz had served Vecna for what may have been centuries, and over that vast span the intelligence in that blade continued its work of quiet corrosion. Each victory Kaz won fed his pride. Each atrocity committed at Vecna's command fed his resentment. The blade gave these sentiments shape and direction until they began to find a clarity of purpose. And the vampire lord, who had been loyal beyond question for longer than most mortals live, finally began to listen. The second betrayal of Vecna comes with a litany of conflicts across the editions. We will take the most widely accepted path in this chapter, but like the other divergent paths related to Kaz, we will break each down in our last chapter. The chronicled timeline of events across almost all of Vecna's history is vague by design, obfuscated to such a degree that giving exact dates on almost anything is nearly impossible. So we must take even the broadest strokes of chronologies with a heavy dose of, this might be completely wrong. That said, the conflicting and vague dates that can be found put the apex of Kaz's betrayal loosely in the negative 4th century before Greyhawk's common year, so sometime between negative 400 and negative 300 CY. The betrayal began without argument or even words, just the silent arc of a blackened blade. When Kaz the Bloody-Handed struck his master, the quiet of the rotted tower shattered into a violence that would shake the foundation of the plains. It is said that no living soul witnessed the confrontation. However, by stitching together a patchwork of ancient, disjointed texts buried in obscure books and accounts from 2nd, 3rd, and likely even 4th hands, we can construct a plausible retelling of one of the most legendary battles ever recorded by mortal hand. The sentient weapon of malice all its own, noted as a longsword in some accounts, a shorter blade in others, managed to partially breach the lich's powerful wards in its initial strikes. Now fully corrupted by the sword's influence, the undead vampire warrior attacked with the frenzied bloodlust of an executioner, driving the blade again and again into the withered flesh of the sovereign lich lord who had empowered him with the gift of undeath. One can only speculate that Vecna was surprised and perhaps taken off guard, yet we know he responded with dark magics of such power and animus that they unstitched reality around them both. The throne room became a blinding battlescape of negative energy, deep life-stealing cuts, and disintegrating forces. Flesh was carved, bones were splintered, and necrotic fires devoured the chamber's oxygen. Lich King and Vampire Lord unleashing all of their terrible powers, a dying god and his monstrous shadow, locked in a ruinous orbit of their own making and destined for but one outcome. The battle would find no victor, only unprecedented destruction. You can leave the heroic fairy tales and legendary fables of epic battles from powerful beings lasting hours on end at the tavern where you heard them, because, witness accounts or not, one thing is of absolute certainty. The collision of such immense powers on a scale of the divine will always have one guaranteed result. Win or lose, victory or defeat, like the fusion of atoms, the impact is sudden, explosive, and devastating to all in the vicinity. In what could be counted in scant minutes or perhaps even seconds, Vecna's seat of power was enveloped in the flash of obliterating light, A colossal tower of decay instantly vaporized into unrecognizable detritus of stone and warped metal. When the arcane ash settled, all that remained was a flattened wasteland of remnant debris where the citadel once stood, now annihilated so completely that its exact location became a matter of dispute between sages and cartographers for centuries to follow. Of Kaz, nothing remained in the material world. We would learn later that he was hurled violently across the plains, though he would persist in other forms and other places. His destination varied by your chosen lore. As for the fate of Vecna, of the greatest necromancer lich of his age, only remnants remained. Vecna was gone, but his evil is the kind of evil too vast to be entirely erased, which brings us to the bodily horrors he left behind. A hand, an eye. We have come a long way, yet also brought full circle back to those two artifacts found on the 50-year-old pages of eldritch wizardry that started it all. These are the remnants of Vecna's physical form after the battle with Kaz the Betrayer, and they are, without exaggeration, two of the most infamous and recognized artifacts in the entire Dungeons & Dragons catalog of magical objects across every edition of the lore that has given them life. The hand and eye of Vecna have appeared in bestiaries, adventure modules, and dungeon master guides for decades, and each have caused torment and ruin in the lives of countless player characters, often accompanied with a wry smile from behind the DM screen. The hand of Vecna is a mummified left hand, blackened and withered, its fingers curled in a gesture that suggests either grasping or perhaps cursing, probably both. To use it, one must be agreeable to an act that speaks volumes about the kind of character who would seek out such an artifact in the first place. To leverage its insidious powers, you must first cut off your own left hand and press the hand of Vecna to the crimson stump. Its dark magic will do the rest, grafting itself to become part of you, granting an evil boon for your sacrifice. The cost, naturally, is your sanity, your soul, and eventually your own agency, as the hand carries with it a sliver of Vecna's will, pulling its bearer ever toward darkness. The Eye of Vecna operates on the same cheery principle, meaning to use it, one must, you guessed it, remove your own eye and place the Eye of Vecna in the weeping, empty socket. It will then grant true sight, the ability to see through illusions and into other planes, and various other visual powers that would be wonderful if they didn't come bundled with such vile acts and corruption. Together, the hand and the eye form a matched set of body horror temptations, granting additional properties together, and have been a litmus test for the ambitious and the desperate since their creation. I hope you will pause to consider what I've just shared, should you ever find one or both of these unholy items of self-mutilation in your travels and adventures. In a game filled with magical swords that can be sheathed, and magic rings that can be slipped on and off at will like Mr. Frodo, the hand and eye of Vecna demand a much higher acquisition cost, and some serious long-term commitment. The symbolism is not subtle. Power from Vecna always costs something essential, and the transaction is irreversible. You do not give back the hand of Vecna. You do not return the eye to its velvet case. Once attached, they are you, and you are, both incrementally and inevitably, becoming something that belongs to Vecna. Of course, any discussion of Vecna's body horror-themed items would be remiss in not mentioning the apocryphal lore of another such artifact, along with the gallows humor that defines its existence. The Head of Vecna, while certainly not originating from the Lich or even a canonical artifact for that matter, it has nonetheless amassed a mythos all its own, and one so infamous it has become, over the years, almost inseparable from any real facts. The mythological tale always follows along the same lines. A group of adventurers discover ancient texts and eventually the powerful artifact that is the head of the Lich Lord himself. Invariably, the tale concludes with one among the party being tricked into believing that, like the hand and eye, Vecna's severed head will grant them some ominous power, and all you have to do to acquire this dark gift is cut off your head in order to install it. Whether such an act has ever actually occurred, let alone succeeded at any table, is of course speculative. But more critically, it isn't really significant. What matters is the meta-lore symbology of an item whose greatest property is found in its grand ability to expose the gullible. Let me know down in the comments if you've ever experienced any such apocryphal lore in your travels. Scholars with even a cursory background in Vecna's lore are likely familiar with the hand and eye that the Lich lost. Others, more well-versed in the dark studies, probably also have some familiarity with the betrayal of Kos and the battle that followed. However, what far fewer know are the events that transpired directly after the Lich King's fall. Vecna's destruction should, by all rights, have been the end of the Lich's story. The tyrant falls, the empire crumbles, scholars write books, and the world moves on. Except, of course, the multiverse is never that simple. Vecna's spirit, stripped of its physical vessel but not its will, still remained, drifting across the plains like those final wisps of smoke from a fire that everyone assumed had long been extinguished. Most fragmented souls, confronted with an eternity of formless wandering, would dissipate into nothing, forgotten to fade out, like a candle flame snuffed by the wind of indifference. But Vecna, even in his lost ethereal form, would not be forgotten, sustained by something that mortals often underestimate: worship. Or perhaps not worship exactly, but something adjacent to worship. Call it obsession, call it fear, or call it the compulsion of the arrogant and the ambitious. Countless wizards and warlocks and their desperate need to reach for forbidden knowledge, even when every sign, omen, and cautionary tale in existence screams their valid warnings to stop. And Vecna's bodily artifacts would each play a role in his return, taking on lives of their own, passing from one power-hungry fool to the next across those long centuries of planar drift. Every necromancer who gouged out their own eye to replace it with his, every warlord who severed their own hand to graft his withered claw, fed him. They were not, strictly speaking, worshippers in the same way the cult of Vecna is. They were something even more useful: unwitting vessels. On the material plane, in the immediate aftermath of his fall, Vecna's surviving warlords did what ambitious soldiers of war throughout history have always done when the tyrant dies: they turned on one another. Whatever intricate plans Vecna had laid for the continuity of his Occluded Empire were quickly torn apart by their infighting and power grabs, and this, we are told, enraged the former Lich King, even in his disembodied state as a drifting, fragmented soul. From beyond death, beyond the plains, beyond what should have been possible, Vecna still held power to show his great displeasure, reaching out to seize each of these squabbling generals in groups of 3, and then fusing them together into the first Skull Lords. Not metaphorically, literally, physically. 3 bodies, 3 skulls, 3 bickering personalities crammed into each single undead abomination. These were the first Skull Lords, and their punishment was unique in its cruelty, cursed to argue among themselves for all eternity, never agreeing, never separating, the walking embodiment of the very dysfunction that had ruined Vecna's legacy. It was, one must admit, a punishment that showed the creative flair of a true homebrew world builder. If you cannot serve Vecna with 1 mind, then you will fail him with 3. Over the grind of untold centuries, the flow of worship and fear channeled toward Vecna accumulated slowly but definitively, until at last the power of such faith allowed Vecna to reconstitute his form, as more than just a lich, but as a demigod of secrets, rooted in the world of Orth and sustained by the devotion of covens and cabals scattered all across the world of Greyhawk. The maimed lord was back, but as he prepared to step into the divinity of godhood, an unnatural mist would begin to roll in as dark eldritch powers prepared to give the Lord of Hidden Knowledge a domain all his own. What happened next is one of the great narrative pivots in the history of any world or setting, and it began with significant overreach. Circa 581, by the common year reckoning of Greyhawk, Vecna attempted to manifest fully as a god upon Earth. The details of this attempt are among the most shocking in the histories of Greyhawk as told by the 1990 adventure module, Vecna Lives. Using a puppet named Halmadar the Cruel who bore his artifacts, Vecna ambushed and slaughtered the Circle of Eight, notable in the lore as the order of the most powerful wizards in the world, including familiar and legendary names such as Tensor, Bigby, and Odaluk. It was the massacre of D&D's own version of the Avengers, a narrative pivot that proved no one, not even the most famous, named, and notable, were safe from Vecna's reach. It was only through the desperate intervention of a band of heroes that the ascending Vecna was finally cast into a planar portal. And here's where the story takes another unexpected and dark turn. Witnessing the events taking place, it would be the dark powers of Ravenloft, patient, deeply malevolent cosmic judges of evil that govern the domains of dread, who saw fit to enact some eldritch justice, intercepting Vecna's falling spirit to be claimed by the Mist. For roughly 2 decades, marked in Ravenloft's slippery Barovian calendar, Vecna's spirit drifted through the Mist while the dark powers constructed something special for him. What they built was not a single domain, but a cluster called the Burning Peaks, a set of interconnected domains designed to torment the Archlich with his greatest failures. Vecna's domain was called Cavicius, and it was a vast, ash-toked wasteland devoid of light, yet visually built as a mocking mirror of his ancient Greyhawk dominion of the same name, situated on the Plain of Ash. At its center stood Citadel Cavicius, a massive fortress shaped like a human skull. Here Vecna ruled, if ruled is the right word for presiding over a kingdom of cinders and silence. But the true karmic cruelty of his imprisonment would be found in a neighboring domain of dread. Directly adjacent to Cavicius, the Dark Powers had seen fit to place the domain of Tovag, and the Dark Lord ruling Tovag was none other than Kaz, the traitor, the betrayer. The Vampire Lord now ruled a domain of temperate forests and rolling hills centered on the militaristic city of Tor Gorak, a city whose sole purpose, whose entire civic identity, was the prosecution of war against Vecna. And so eternal strife would continue. Kaz's armies would march into the ashen wastes of Cavicius, laying siege to the skull-shaped citadel, and Vecna's undead legions would counterattack, pushing them back into the forests of Tovag, an endless cycle where neither could ever achieve true victory because the Dark Powers would not allow it. It was a war without resolution, a conflict only for conflict's sake, designed to produce nothing but frustration forever. The Dark Powers, whatever else might one say about them, understand their craft better than most. For decades, the war between Vecna and Kaz played out in a perfect bloody loop, a tragic war song forever on repeat. Vecna, however, was not the sort of being who would accept forever as a binding term. Vecna's first attempt to escape the shackles of Ravenloft came through acts of subtlety rather than force. As noted across the 2nd edition texts of Vecna Reborn and the Domains of Dread resource, as a Lich Dark Lord, Vecna would slowly see the formation of a cult of dedicated followers across the domain, led by a human priest in the city of Tor Gorak named Vokar the Obedient, and together they devised a disturbing ritual. The centerpiece of this unholy plan was the grief-stricken niece of Vokar, a human female named Merit, who had recently lost her husband. As the story is told, Merit was left in a state of amnesia. There is no comfortable way to say this, so let's just say Vokar would be instrumental in the planned pregnancy of Merit with the Dark Lord Lich's essence. The intent of this sinister act was for Vecna to be literally reborn into a new physical body, one unbound by the hold of Ravenloft's mists, allowing Vecna to escape from the domain of dread. It was, one must concede, clever if an altogether vile plan. The plot would be foiled by the concluding events of the adventure when a group of heroes confront and defeat Vokar to disrupt the ritual, save Merit, and ensure that Vecna would remain a prisoner of Ravenloft's dark powers, at least for a time. But Vecna would learn from this failure, and what he delivered next was an even more audacious masterwork that would not only free him from Ravenloft, but elevate him to divine status in the process. This second escape plot would be detailed in the events of 2000's Die Vecna Die adventure, and hinged primarily on the manipulation of a known rival and Greyhawk demigod, Ayuz the Old, who it should be noted is the Cambion son of the demon lord Grost and the human witch Igwilv. The lure was set in motion when Ayuz discovers an ancient tablet claiming that Vecna was in a weakened state and had taken refuge at a location called Toveg Baragu. Believing he can finally eliminate his longtime rival, Ayuz marched his forces to this site. Of course, this was all a trap, the tablet a tool of misinformation. While Ayuz was not killed in the encounter, Vecna had prepared a metaphysical ritual to absorb the Cambion god's divine portfolio of powers, leaving Ayuz a defeated, broken, and formless god, serving only as a battery for Vecna's own divine ascension. And here is where we find a key to such a brilliant scheme. The dark powers that serve as warden of these domains of dread can imprison mortals. They can even contain demigods. But Vecna believed they would not be able to hold a true god. As it turned out, Vecna was at least partially correct. Drawing upon his newly stolen divinity, Vecna achieved the unthinkable, breaking the mist-bound shackles of Ravenloft. Vecna was freed, and his destination would land him on ground no god had ever stepped foot on before. Sigil, the City of Doors, sits at the theoretical center of the multiverse, a torus-shaped city balanced atop a colossal spire and located in the Outlands, governed by one of the most mysterious and perhaps powerful of beings in the Lady of Pain. Sigil's most defining law, the one rule that supersedes all others, is quite simple: no gods allowed. The Lady of Pain enforces this edict absolutely and with zero tolerance. Deities have tried over the millennia to enter, with each attempt blocked, rebuffed, or if they are particularly persistent, banished to their own maze-filled demi-plane to wander ever lost. This prohibition exists for one practical reason. If gods were allowed into Sigil, they would fight over it, and a divine war fought inside the City of Doors would risk annihilation of far more than just the city, potentially the entire planar structure of our multiverse. Yet, according to the historic lore of the Die Vecna Die campaign, Vecna now found himself on ground no god had trespassed before. In escaping Ravenloft, we can only speculate that Vecna had bypassed these wards through some form of cosmic loophole. He had not been a greater god when he began his escape. He had been a demigod who then absorbed the divinity of Ayuz. But he did so while inside the domain of dread, which is notable here because those prison demi-planes exist outside of normal planar geography. This, combined with Vecna's own powers, born at least in part from the serpent deity Mox-like, as we covered in part 1 of this series, somehow allowed him to punch a planar hole directly into Sigil. Now, this may sound like a convenient and even literal use of the literary Deus Ex Machina narrative trope, which is why I mention Vecna's ancient ties to Mox-like. You see, there exists in deeper lore chapters of the classic text a tantalizing but obscure suggestion that the Lady of Pain and the serpent deity Mox-like may be related entities, perhaps the last two of the same order, members of a class of powerful beings called the Ancient Brethren. This would of course make them powers that predate even the gods, existing in texts written long before even the primordial theories of Dawn War creation, and that operate on a level of reality that even the realm's lore pantheon could not fully comprehend. So, if true, this would plausibly explain how Vecna, channeling Mox-like's power, was able to breach wards that had held against every other deity in the multiverse, some more powerful than Vecna was at this stage. It is a well-crafted narrative, or call it a theory, that I appreciate, strongly suggesting Vecna was, in essence, using a proverbial key forged from the same material as the lock. But regardless of how he breached Sigil's defenses, doing so disrupted and destabilized the city's wars, and, one imagines, deeply annoyed the Lady of Pain. Come to think of it, however, annoyed is most likely the wrong word to use here. The Lady of Pain does not, so far as anyone knows, experience emotions in any way that would validate annoyance or any mortally understood emotion. But her unemotional response to this intrusion still tells us something important about the stakes involved. The Lady of Pain did not destroy Vecna, and this was not because she was unable to. In fact, a reading between the lines even posits, rather strongly I might add, that she very well could have destroyed the newly ascended Vecna if she had reacted with those same mortal emotions. However, she chose not to, because she, more than any other being, knows the cost of doing so in the City of Doors. The text offers a scenario not unlike the one I outlined in Vecna's battle with Kaz the Betrayer, that a direct confrontation between two beings of such magnitude, fought within the walls of the City of Doors, risked annihilating Sigil and unraveling the cosmology of the multiverse, the very catastrophe that the Lady of Pain's No God's rule was designed to prevent in the first place. However, once inside Sigil, Vecna's ambitions became crystal clear. He intended to rewrite the cosmology of the multiverse, to reshape reality according to his will, in order to make himself a supreme god among gods. It was a form of megalomania on a scale that even megalomaniacs might find excessive. His eventual defeat would come mostly by mortal hands, with a little help from the Lady of Sigil. We must remember, after all, this lore is all part of the Die Vecna Die adventure campaign. The heroes would break his physical form, then at last the Lady of Pain acted. She ejected Vecna from Sigil, repairing the breach and creating new wards to ensure such a divine intrusion would not happen again. However, the larger damage was irreversible, and this is where the campaign arc and the story of Vecna transcend its own in-universe narrative to become part of the meta, the genesis for real change across Dungeons & Dragons. The saga, as chronicled in Die Vecna Die, was explicitly written to provide an in-universe explanation for the transition away from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition to D&D's 3rd edition of the lore. Vecna's presence in Sigil, his attempt to rewrite reality, had damaged the fundamental fabric underlying all planes, all worlds, and as it would turn out, all rules of the multiverse. The lore goes on to explain that the Lady of Pain, in repairing the damage to the cosmological framework, was forced to remake reality, and in doing so, many facets of existence were forced to change, providing context to one of the most drastic mechanical changes Dungeons & Dragons would experience, aka bye-bye Thaco, negative armor classes, and so much more. While I have personal mixed feelings on the changes themselves, I both understand why they were required, and more importantly, to any lore scholar, really appreciate the in-universe efforts made to give weight and reason to such an out-of-game mechanical change. So I would challenge each of us to remember that the story authors rarely make such dramatic mechanical decisions, so love or hate the departure, we can all applaud what is a remarkable piece of narrative craft to let story tell us why the planes had rearranged themselves. In a way, this means Vecna succeeded in his ambition to rewrite reality, just not in the way he intended. No being as old and ruthlessly ambitious as Vecna exists in isolation. Every tyrant is, in the end, a portrait painted by the people around them. They are the servants who enable, the rivals who define, and the traitors who reveal what the tyrant truly feared. Vecna's story is no different. Among his servants, the most faithful might be the least known. She is the Bronze Lich of 4th edition lore, known as Lady Osterneth, who I have detailed with both origin story and lore in 2 early videos on this channel. The Lady Osterneth masquerades as a beautiful noblewoman while secretly corrupting leaders toward evil, and serves as one of his more powerful agents on the material plane, fully devoted to Vecna and all his sinister schemes. Yet what I find most interesting about the Bronze Lich is her possession of one of the more obscure of Vecna's body horror-inspired artifacts, the Heart of Vecna. Primarily found in 4th edition's Open Grave Secrets of the Undead resource, the Heart of Vecna is a shriveled, still faintly pulsing organ shed in his transformation into undeath, and now lodged in the chest cavity of the Lady Osterneth, serving as both a focus for her own power and a token of her strong devotion to Vecna. More surprising, perhaps, is the allegiance of Falazur, the dragon god of undeath, whose portfolio overlapped with Vecna's interest in ways that made alliance more profitable than rivalry. And then there is Vokar, who we touched on a few chapters ago. Once known as the Obedient, and later the Disobedient, his relationship to Vecna soured after the failed rebirth ritual, a reminder that you only find grace with the Whispered One until you are no longer useful, something most of us on the material plane can certainly relate to. Vecna's divine rivals are also numerous. Among them we find the Raven Queen, the singular goddess of death in 4e lore, who found herself demoted in modern lore of 5th edition, now relegated to primarily governing the domain of fragmented memories. As a true neutral god of death in the 4th edition text, the Raven Queen opposed Vecna purely on principle, his entire existence an affront to the natural order that she so embodied. There is, of course, Foltest, the Greyhawk god of light and rigid law, long-standing as Vecna's philosophical opposite, a deity of blinding clarity set against the undead keeper of hidden knowledge. Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, was a rival in perhaps the truest sense of the word, as they endlessly compete for dominion over the same metaphysical territory of undeath. And St. Cuthbert, the Greyhawk god of retribution, who opposes Vecna with his dogged, unshakable determination of a being whose entire divine purpose was the punishment of exactly the kind of overreach that Vecna embodied. There are others, but what emerges from all of these relationships, be they the servants who were used and discarded, or the rivals who could never quite destroy him, Vecna has always endured. But of all his relationships, servant, rival, or deity, perhaps none is more defining or more cosmically destructive than his eternal feud with Kaz the Betrayer. It is a rivalry so absolute that it drives the culminating events of the modern 5th edition lore. For Vecna, every betrayal and every alliance has been a rehearsal for a single moment, a moment that finally arrived in the modern age and one the multiverse may not survive. The past is over. The eve of ruin has begun. This chapter will cover some narrative elements, campaign structures, and even some late-game reveals from Vecna Eve of Ruin. While not a fully spoilered review, if you plan to play the campaign as a player or simply want to preserve the mystery, I would still encourage you to skip to the timestamp on the screen now. In 2024, Wizards of the Coast released Vecna Eve of Ruin, and with it the most ambitious Vecna storyline since Die Vecna Die, released well over 2 decades ago. And if you have followed this deep dive from the beginning, you're about to see every thread we have traced across the Lich's history pulled taut at last. Let's take a moment to consider what Vecna has endured by this point in the chronology. The loss of a mother, the betrayal of a Sararak, the treachery of Kaz, the destruction of his Occluded Empire, imprisonment in the domains of dread, his breach of Sigil, the closest any being has ever come to rewriting the cosmological framework of existence, and even the destruction of his physical form. Centuries of incorporeal wandering sustained by his legacy of fear and the worship of evil mortals. Each defeat would, and in many cases has, ended a lesser villain story. But the maimed lord is anything but a lesser villain. He is a being of evil divine who has made failure into fuel and setback into strategy. And by the time we reach the 5th edition lore, the question is no longer whether Vecna can return, but will the multiverse survive? Yet it all begins rather simply, almost mundane for heroes of this scope. A noble vanishes from the streets of Neverwinter. No ransom note, no body, just questions that nobody in power seems interested in answering. That's how it all starts, not with the howl of cosmic reckoning or the trembling of gods. Just a missing person, the kind of small human mystery that most heroes cut their adventurous teeth on all the way back in the lost mines of Phandelver. The heroes find and follow a trail leading to the cult of Vecna. Vecna's faithful working in shadow, harvesting secrets. Your first hint at the grand scale of the adventures ahead comes as the world blinks and our heroes are torn from Neverwinter, landing upon the streets of Sigil. The City of Doors knows exactly how important it is and resents any need to remind you. Factions bicker, portals open and snap shut in alleyways, and above it all drifts the Lady of Pain, silent and void of emotion, her shadow alone a sentence no god, including Vecna, has ever successfully appealed. The adventurers are summoned to the Sanctum of the Seven by the Wizards of Three, Illustrial Silverhand, Tasha, known in many circles as the complicated Witch Queen Igwilv, and Mordenkainen, the legendary Archmage. Three of the most powerful spellcasters in existence, gathered in one room in Sigil, and they seem most concerned, one might even suggest afraid. Their message is blunt. Vecna has devised a ritual of staggering power and scope called the Ritual of Remaking. Vecna's goal here seems to mirror his original designs during his failed breach of Sigil we covered earlier. Fed by stolen secrets and channeled through chimes that ring across the planes, this ritual is nothing short of the complete unraveling of the multiverse and its reweaving, thread by thread, world by world, plane by plane, in Vecna's image. Every world, every god, every law of magic and physics remade so that the Whispered One sits at the foundation of all that exists. The plan to stop such a grand plan hinges on one of the most legendary single artifacts known to history, but unfortunately this single artifact is a rod currently shattered into 7 parts. Clarity at last. Find the pieces, assemble the rod, destroy the ritual. Simple enough on parchment, far more lethal in practice. What follows is a cosmic scavenger hunt that spans the breadth of the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse, each fragment of the rod hidden in a different iconic world or infamous location, each guarded by a unique set of horrors and challenges. The heroes will take a blinding tour across the worlds of Eberron, Krynn, Ravenloft, Greyhawk, the Outer Planes, the Nine Hells, and even trespass upon the remains of dead gods in the Astral Sea. 7 powerful fragments, 7 historic worlds and destinations, 1 rod, and a few twists along the way. Yet the greatest threat to Vecna's triumph are not the gods, not the Wizards of Three or some dark powers, or even the heroes completely. Standing as the Lich God's greatest obstacle is, once again, his former bloody-handed lieutenant, Kaz the Betrayer. He has escaped the mists of Ravenloft to challenge Vecna's authority and his grand plans of universal domination. 2 villains, 2 apocalyptic plans, and a table of heroes standing between them with a weapon both of them want. The irony found in the continued persistence of the same single variable that has ruined every one of Vecna's plans across millennia is both tangible and asserts itself one final time. Mortals. Fragile, stubborn, unreasonable mortals who refuse to let existence end on someone else's terms. Should the heroes succeed, and at your table perhaps they do, the hard-luck Lich God's physical form shatters once again. The ritual collapses, the chimes fall silent, and the multiverse can once again exhale. But it is not that neat, not that simple. It never is. Secrets that Vecna managed to reveal remain. Truths can never be recovered. Knowledge that has been permanently erased. You already knew how the campaign would end. It's a player adventure after all. But you also know it's the richness of lore and the many paths in between where your true reward lies. And Vecna? His end is not that complete, not that final. It never is. Vecna's divinity is not extinguished. He has been destroyed before. He has been imprisoned, scattered, exiled, broken, and diminished. And he came back every single time. And when the dust settles on the Eve of Ruin campaign, when the party stands in the wreckage of what was nearly the end of everything, a lesson lands with a familiar weight. It is not just the weight of this story, but the combined weight of countless tomes written across worlds, editions, and timelines on the most enduring villain in all of RPG history. And somewhere in the blackness between stars, drifting on an astral wind that blows between dimensions, the Whispered One waits, patient, enduring. He has, after all, nothing but time. Bonus chapter coming up, but if you'd like to be taken deeper into the dark than we've ever gone before with a Vecna Part 3, then consider that like button a torch to lore enlightenment. I have over 140 hours invested in this single video, so if you found it at all interesting or informative, consider supporting the work with a like, subscribe, hype, and enabling the notifications bell. And if you'd like to show extended support, my Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee tip links are below. To my Patreon and channel members that make these videos possible, thank you, sincerely. Now let's enter that promised archive of obscure lore, giving you just a taste of what may come in a Part 3. Every proper history possesses a dusty forgotten archive, a place where the well-worn paths of lore and the confident narrative voices see their perfectly organized chronologies begin to diverge and fray into conflicts under the weight of time and changing authors. We have now arrived inside that forgotten chamber of fascinating knowledge lost, challenged, or perhaps buried intentionally. Starting with the lore of Kaz the Betrayer and his infamous sword. As we detailed in this deep dive, the most widely accepted lore holds that the blade's sentient intelligence whispered corruption into Kaz's mind, goading him toward betrayal. But some obscure Greyhawk texts instead credit Ner'l, god of death in the Greyhawk pantheon, who supposedly promised Kaz a divine boon for slaying Vecna. And over in Critical Role's world of Exandria, the sword carries a fraction of Kaz's own consciousness rather than Vecna's. This makes very little sense to me personally, though I concede it may serve a purpose in that world's own continuity that I'm not overly familiar with. However, the theory I find most compelling is really an expansion of the lore that appeared in Dragon Magazine number 402. It was found in an article by Ken Hart titled History Check, Kaz and Vecna. The lore here repositions the blade as something far more characteristically Vecna. I've placed the entire excerpt on screen for those interested, but the primary thrust of this expanded lore better frames Vecna's intent in bestowing such a gift, a surveillance device. According to this account, the sword was forged from the frozen heart of a fallen star, and as Vecna spoke the final enchantments, he pulled a thread of shadow from his own consciousness and wrapped it around the black blade. From that point forward, Vecna could then listen to his future betrayer's activities and sometimes even his thoughts. This positioned the blade as a leash as much as a reward. Which brings us to Kaz's vampirism, where the sources differ greatly. While the lore across editions is a bit fragmented, the most compelling narrative is the track I detailed in this deep dive, that the usefulness of a human mortal to Vecna would be limited to a few decades, a blink of an eye to an immortal lich, making it not only plausible, but likely that Vecna, who valued Kaz enough to personally forge a blade for him, to grant him a form of immortality to extend his service. Yet when we examine the meta-history, the how and when of this transformation seems to follow at least two, perhaps three distinct canonical, but at times incompatible tracks, two of which I will posit actually support the lore as I have covered it. The first track, rooted in early AD&D and 2nd edition, is also the most telling, presenting Kaz as the, quote, vampire traitor. While these classic texts do little in the way of elaborating on that, establishing this as simple fact rather than any plot point, it is still notable. While the mechanism of his change is left unknown, this introduction as a vampire traitor fully supports a timeline that Kaz would have had to have been an undead vampire during Vecna's service. The second track is where this diverges greatly and emerges from the Ravenloft and Burning Peaks era of the 3rd edition, a time when White Wolf published many of the D&D sourcebooks. This version claims the vampiric transformation was post-betrayal, suggesting Kaz was a human mortal during his service to Vecna, only becoming a vampire after the climactic battle when he was expelled to the plains through a corrosive, soul-warping proximity to the negative energy plane. Atmospheric as that version may sound, I find it collapses under really any inspection. If Kaz were just a mortal, his entire service to Vecna would be compressed to a decade or two, hardly enough for one person to rise to such prominence in service to an undead immortal, let alone challenge a being of Vecna's magnitude in that final climactic battle. The math, as they say, at least to me, does not math. And for the 3rd and final tract, it seems the authors of the modern lore agreed, adding new lore in support of a gifted ritual of necromancy. Using the silver mask of Kaz, Vecna is said to have deliberately bound his lieutenant into undead vampiric service. The issue is 100% subtle to me, but I always want to present all known paths so you can make your own judgments. Okay, on to the most infamous of Vecna's artifacts. 1st and 2nd edition lore never specifically state that the hand and eye of Vecna were severed from the Lich King by way of Kaz and the Black Blade he was gifted during their climactic battle. Those early texts say only that the hand, the eye, and the sword survived the apocalyptic result of the finality of that battle. 3rd edition would attempt to nail that story down, asserting that the blade in fact did the severing. This is a useful reminder that ambiguity in lore is often a feature and not a flaw, leaving questions unanswered like unpainted portions of a canvas to keep world-building doors open. Even more strange is the variation found in the graphic novel Hand of the Revenant, which I concede some may have never even considered canonical in the first place. But it's still notable in its claim that destructive magic from the priests of Foltest were the cause of Vecna's loss of hand and eye. Now, to accept this, you would need to discard a mountain of established canon that places the artifacts at the site of the final battle, or believe Vecna regrew the exact same parts only to lose them yet again. And so we reach the end of this 2-part lore expedition, starting from the pages of a 1976 supplement to the fractured cosmology of modern D&D. We have covered a lot, but believe me when I tell you, the rabbit hole runs deeper still. The god of hidden knowledge always has another secret to be found. Thank you for joining me on this expedition. Now you may want to go outside and touch grass for a bit. To my legendary patrons and channel members, thank you. Your support is what makes these deep dives possible, and I do not take it for granted. I hope you will all join me on the next one. Until then, take care, my friends.